Most people have no idea how much of their life they've already given away. Not in money, not in time, but in energy. The quiet kind, the emotional kind, the kind that moves when you pray, when you confess, when you kneel, when you hope. For centuries, the Church has insisted that this exchange is holy, necessary, sacred. But what if we've misunderstood what's actually happening? What if worship was never about salvation, but about harvesting? This isn't about attacking faith. This is about understanding a structure that has existed in plain sight, a structure built on church vampire protocols, where devotion is nourishment, where surrender is currency, and where your life force is the resource being moved. And here's the part that turns everything upside down. The Church never feared demons, heresy, or sin. It feared you realizing how powerful your vitality actually is. Because once you understand that attention is energy, you begin to see the rituals differently. The confession that makes you feel lighter suddenly looks like extraction. The hymn that makes you tremble suddenly feels like resonance being drawn out of you. And the priest, calm, glowing, elevated after the ceremony, begins to look a lot like a spiritual energy vampire church conduit rather than a mediator of heaven. This isn't fantasy. This isn't superstition. This is emotional physics. Where attention flows, energy goes, and the Church has always known exactly how to direct it. Occult church secrets, vampire priest ritual practices, and occult blood covenant protocols were not invented in secret chambers. They evolved in the open, cloaked in stained glass, incense, and sermons about humility. But here's the part that changes everything. If energy can be harvested, it can also be reclaimed. And when you reclaim it, the hierarchy collapses. So today we are going to walk through these secret vampire rituals step by step, not as metaphor, not as symbolism, but as applied spiritual mechanics. And by the time we reach the end, you will understand exactly what has been feeding on your devotion and how to take your life force back. Breathe. Stay open. Everything you thought was symbolic is about to become literal. There has always been a quiet tension inside religious history that most never notice, a shadow that lingers beneath stained glass and hymns. The Church has publicly portrayed itself as a guardian against darkness, warding off demons, witches, heretics. But privately, what it has feared most is something far simpler and far more powerful: the loss of the soul's vitality. Ancient teachings considered life not just breath or heartbeat, but a luminous presence residing within blood and spirit. And once a person understood how their life force could be directed, shared, or drained, the entire foundation of spiritual authority trembled. This is the root behind what some now refer to as church vampire protocols, a term whispered in obscure manuscripts and esoteric commentaries, hinting that the Church was less concerned with protecting souls and more concerned with acquiring and preserving them. Throughout old theological writings, there is a recurring metaphor that blood remembers, not like memory in the sense of stories or moments, but memory in the sense of essence, identity, will, spiritual luminosity. Many early mystics believed that vitality could be shifted from one being to another through emotional surrender, ritual devotion, or physical covenant. This wasn't superstition, it was a psychological and energetic understanding long before psychology existed. When one kneels before another, confesses, opens the heart, and lowers their defenses, a subtle exchange occurs. Modern scholars might reduce this to symbolic influence, but those who studied occult church secrets understood it differently. They described devotion as a feeding, and they documented priests who mastered this process not as teachers, but as vessels harvesting life force. To grasp the magnitude of this concept, imagine a candle flame. When protected, it burns strong and warm, but when exposed to wind, it flickers and weakens. Early theologians believed the soul's vitality behaved the same way. If surrounded by manipulation, guilt, fear, or enforced obedience, its flame dimmed. But if strengthened through clarity, self-awareness, and inner sovereignty, it grew. The unsettling implication is that some rituals we assume were meant to protect our flame were instead shaping it for extraction. The existence of spiritual energy vampire church practices becomes imaginable when we consider that institutions built on devotion require constant replenishment. And the easiest well to draw from is the faithful, those who surrender willingly, believing every offering is sacred. There are medieval documents describing secret gatherings held in crypts rather than sanctuaries. There, the atmosphere was not celebratory but heavy, intentional, almost predatory. The participants weren't heretics or occultists, they were priests, not the gentle, compassionate shepherds we are encouraged to envision, but high-ranking figures studying vampire priest ritual techniques. They believed life force could be transferred through attention, emotion, and proximity. And if devotion is attention and attention is energy, then rituals that focus and direct that attention are essentially energy funnels. This transforms worship from a spiritual practice into a harvest. A person doesn't need to drink blood to behave like a vampire. They only need to absorb vitality. Consider how a charismatic leader can walk into a room and everyone feels something shift. Some call it presence, some call it power. But what if that sensation is not merely personality, but intake? Esoteric scholars describe life force harvesting church methods, where leaders train to draw energy unconsciously through eye contact, vocal cadence, and emotional invocation. This is not fantasy. You've felt it in life before, when someone leaves you energized or when someone leaves you drained. The difference lies in intention. A nurturing presence shares energy. A parasitic presence consumes it. And when consumption becomes ritualized, refined, and institutionalized, it becomes indistinguishable from esoteric vampire theology. What makes this idea so disturbing is not the rituals themselves, but how ordinary they appear. There's no thunder, no blood drinking, no dark cloaks, just hymns, confessions, kneeling, and emotional exposure. The everyday believer never suspects that the posture of prayer is the posture of surrender, and the posture of surrender is the opening of the soul. When repeated weekly, monthly, yearly, an entire congregation becomes a reservoir of vitality, and those who understand how to redirect that vitality rise in influence naturally, almost effortlessly. This is how hidden cult in the church structures formed, not through rebellion, but through mastery of energy dynamics others didn't realize existed. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is that the church never needed to deny this directly. It only needed to obscure it beneath metaphor, by calling energy grace, extraction, sacrifice, and surrender devotion. The mechanisms were hidden in plain sight. The faithful believed they were giving something holy, never realizing the exchange was unbalanced. This has been referred to as vampire archetype priesthood, where the priest is not just a guide, but a vessel who nourishes himself on the vitality of others, sanctified by institution and invisible to scrutiny. The idea is disturbing, yes, but it opens a door that leads somewhere deeper. And that door leads us to a time before the church existed at all. Long before the church ever carved crosses into stone or built cathedrals reaching toward heaven, there were priest kings who understood something about life that we are only now beginning to remember. They believed the soul was not simply a concept, but a living radiance stored within the blood. Not metaphor, not poetry, literal essence. In ancient Mesopotamia, Canaan, and Egypt, rituals were performed where the life essence of one individual was believed to strengthen the spiritual authority of another. These rites served as the blueprint for what would later become church vampire history-revealed practices. The transfer of life force wasn't seen as dark or forbidden. It was considered sacred, even necessary for maintaining cosmic balance. When a ruler stood before his people, he wasn't admired for power, but for how much essence he carried within him. The ancient priest-kings saw blood as the physical vessel of spirit. They believed lineage itself was formed not just by birth, but by how much life force a family could accumulate and protect across generations. This is why royal bloodlines were guarded, purified, arranged through careful unions, and sometimes even sanctified through ritual sacrifice. Modern people assume sacrifice meant violence, but in many cases, it meant voluntary offering of vitality through devotion, attention, and spiritual surrender. What we might today call vampire priest secrets exposed was once considered the highest form of religious intimacy. The chosen ones offered life not because they were oppressed, but because they believed they were participating in something eternal. It is important to understand that these rituals were not monstrous in their original context. They were seen as nourishment between worlds, the living feeding the divine and the divine feeding the living. A relationship, not exploitation. But when power structures grew and institutions formed, This delicate exchange shifted into imbalance. The ones who officiated the rites learned they could collect life force without giving anything back. What was once sacred became extractive, and this is how the foundation of occult blood covenant protocols emerged, not through evil intentions, but through a gradual decay of reciprocity. When a ritual that once served all begins to serve only a few, it takes on the appearance of vampirism. When Christianity rose, it did not destroy these practices, it inherited them. The early church converted temples into basilicas, priest-kings into bishops, and ancient rites into liturgy. But the underlying mechanics of life force exchange remained the same. Only the symbols changed. The chalice now held wine instead of blood, but the belief that essence could be transferred through ritual presence remained. The congregations believed they were participating in worship. The clergy understood they were participating in vitality exchange. This is how secret vampire rituals survived the shift of ages, not through rebellion, but through assimilation. The most skilled priests were those who knew how to draw devotion without coercion. They learned that guilt makes the heart open, suffering makes the spirit vulnerable, and longing makes attention cling. These psychological insights formed the core of the spiritual energy vampire church dynamic, not because these priests were malicious, but because they inherited a system optimized for extracting vitality. The structure was already there. All they needed was obedience and repetition. Ritual repetition is hypnosis, and hypnosis, performed weekly, becomes identity. To understand this clearly, imagine giving someone your full emotional attention, your admiration, your belief, your longing for meaning. Imagine doing that every week, for years. The energy exchanged is real. You can feel it. This is why after certain ceremonies, the congregation leaves drained while the officiating priest seems invigorated, glowing, powerful. This is not coincidence. It is pattern. A pattern as old as civilizations. This is vampire protocol explained not as fantasy, but as emotional physics. Where attention goes, energy flows. When Christianity absorbed the world's older religions, it absorbed their secrets as well. But it hid them, renamed them, disguised them under doctrine and symbol. The rites of life force exchange did not disappear, they simply shifted shape. And what was once spoken openly in temples became whispered behind monastery doors, which leads us to something the church has worked hard to disguise as symbolic. A ritual everyone knows, a ritual everyone has witnessed, a ritual believed to be only metaphor. But was it? There is a moment in every religious ritual where the ordinary becomes sacred, where bread becomes body and wine becomes blood, at least in belief. But what most people don't realize is that this belief was never meant to be symbolic. In early Christian sects, the Eucharist was understood literally, not metaphorically. It wasn't about remembering the divine, it was about consuming its residual presence. Those who participated believed that the spiritual essence of a sacrificed being remained attached to its offering. This is where church vampire protocols quietly unfold, because if essence can be consumed, essence can be transferred. And if it can be transferred, someone benefits more than others. Devotion was never just reverence, it was nourishment. The earliest followers of Jesus didn't see the Eucharist as theater or poetic gesture. They gathered in small chambers, whispered prayers, and believed that what they ingested stitched them more closely to the divine life force. Bread and wine were seen as vessels containing a presence that could fuse with their own spirit. Over time, the church publicly softened this into symbolism, insisting the meaning was spiritual. But behind closed doors, certain sects continued viewing the ritual as real essence transformation. This is the hidden thread connecting the Eucharist to secret vampire rituals, where the divine is not observed, but consumed. To understand why this mattered, imagine believing that the life force of the holy could become part of your own. Imagine thinking that one could absorb purity, longevity, wisdom, simply by consuming sanctified essence. For early believers, this wasn't superstition, it was technology, a technology of spirit. The ritual wasn't meant to inspire faith, it was meant to change the participants, and those who controlled this ritual understood the power they held. They weren't just priests, they were gatekeepers to vitality itself. The vampire priest ritual didn't require fangs, only authority. As centuries passed, the church faced a dilemma. Too many followers were taking the ritual literally. People began believing they could access divine power directly. They no longer needed priests, only the ritual. This threatened hierarchy. So the Church began declaring the Eucharist symbolic in public doctrine. Meanwhile, in private chambers, monasteries, and cathedral crypts, select clergy continued the older understanding that essence can be stored, passed, ingested. This was the birth of dark occult church practices, two religions running parallel, one for the masses, one for those who feed. Think of how many times someone has walked into a sanctuary feeling empty and left feeling lighter, calmer, warm, while the officiant leaves energized, radiant, strengthened. Something is exchanged. The question is not whether energy moves, but who directs its flow. The Eucharist became the perfect mask for esoteric vampire theology, a ritual of giving disguised as a ritual of receiving. People believed they were receiving grace, but the emotional vulnerability, surrender, and longing released during the ritual made them wide open to vitality extraction. A ritual inside a ritual. Even the language used by clergy reveals this. The priest offers up the congregation's devotion, their longing, their suffering. The term offer up is not symbolic, it's transactional. Something is being moved. Something is being directed. This is how spiritual energy vampire church dynamics became embedded in liturgy. What appears holy may still be holy, but holiness can be harvested. The ritual does not require deception to function, it only requires participation. And participation has never been hard to obtain when people are searching for meaning, redemption, relief. So when the church insisted that bread and wine were only symbols, it wasn't because the belief changed, but because the public narrative needed to. If the masses understood the Eucharist as literal essence exchange, they might begin to realize they possess essence worth taking. And if they understood that their vitality is powerful, radiant, magnetic, they might begin to wonder who is benefiting from it. This is the threshold where belief becomes awakening. And those who awaken begin to see something else entirely, something particularly disturbing about how the church treated children. There is a reason the church has always placed children at the center of its most sacred spaces. Choirs of angelic voices, young acolytes carrying candles, orphan boys trained to serve in silence. This imagery is not accidental. In medieval theology, there existed the belief of pure eternus, the eternal child, whose soul held a brighter, purer life force. Unlike adults, who were weighed down by guilt, desire, and trauma, children were seen as living vessels of uncorrupted vitality. In certain monasteries and cathedral schools, practices emerged that were less about teaching and more about cultivating energy. Scholars studying church vampire protocols note that proximity, devotion, and emotional attachment were the mechanisms of extraction, not violence. The child's presence itself became a source of nourishment. Medieval monasteries were constructed in arrangements that facilitated this slow, invisible transfer of vitality. Dormitories centered around a master's quarters, prayer circles where the children faced inward toward the priest, choral formations designed to direct emotional intensity toward a single focal point. These were architectural rituals, structures built to channel energy. To the common faithful, this looked like education and worship. But to those who understood esoteric vampire theology, the pattern was unmistakable. The young generate life force. The elder absorbs it. Not because the elder is evil, but because the elder is empty. Age depletes the flame. Youth radiates it. It's important to understand that this was not framed as exploitation. The church believed it was preserving the vitality of the young by integrating it into sacred purpose. They taught that a child serving in devotion was participating in eternal life. But beneath this doctrine was a more practical mechanism. Children bond quickly, trust fully, and love intensely. Their devotion is pure, unguarded, overflowing. And devotion is nourishment. Spiritual energy vampire church dynamics rely on an open heart. A child's heart is always open. The clergy did not need force. They only needed affection. Affection becomes attachment. Attachment becomes dependence. Dependence becomes surrender. Consider the emotional experience of a child raised in such an environment. He is taught that the priest is his protector, guide, and doorway to the divine. His identity is shaped around pleasing the priest, around being seen as good, obedient, holy. His soul becomes oriented toward giving. The priest does not take, it is simply offered. This is why many survivors of such upbringings report not trauma of violence, but a strange emptiness, a feeling that something was drawn out of them slowly over time. The subtle extraction of vitality leaves no scars, just a quiet absence. This reflects the core of hidden cult in the church practices. The deepest wounds are invisible. Choir schools are among the strongest historical examples of this. The singing voice is breath-shaped by emotion. When a child sings with devotion, longing, and innocence, they are releasing life force in its purest form. The conductor, the officiant, the priest stands in the center of the sound. Waves of devotion flow toward him, surrounding him, filling him. He glows. He strengthens. The congregation sees this as spiritual authority, when in truth it is energetic accumulation. Vampire priest ritual techniques do not require secrecy when everyone assumes the exchange is holy. Even orphanages were often attached to monasteries not out of charity, but out of spiritual economics. Children without families form attachments to authority even faster. Their longing for belonging, love, and recognition creates a continuous flow of emotional energy. Priests trained in the old ways knew how to cultivate that longing, not fulfill it. It is lack that fuels devotion. The child is never allowed to truly feel complete gekat, because completion would close the heart. This is an unspoken foundation of dark occult church practices. You keep the source open by keeping the soul yearning. And this doctrine did not vanish. It merely evolved. While society now believes these practices are relics of the past, the architecture remains, the liturgy remains, the emotional mechanisms remain. The church no longer speaks of living hosts, but the pattern of directing pure devotion toward figures of authority continues, which leads to a realization that reshapes the entire vampire archetype itself, not as a monster stalking the night, but as a holy figure dressed in white and gold, feeding not on blood, but on faith. And that brings us to something the church has spent centuries hiding in plain sight. The vampire was never meant to be a monster. It was meant to be a priest. Most people assume worship is about honoring something greater than themselves, offering love, praise, and devotion to the divine. But what if worship is actually a technology, a mechanism that transfers life force from the worshipper to the one being worshipped? In psychological terms, attention is energy. Emotion is energy. Surrender is energy. When a person kneels, bows the head, opens the chest, and confesses their deepest fears, they are not merely expressing faith, they are releasing vitality. Those who stand in positions of spiritual authority receive this release. This is where the idea of spiritual energy vampire church dynamics begins. Worship is not adoration. Worship is surrender, and surrender creates a flow. If devotion generates energy, then the one receiving devotion is being fed. Throughout history, the priestly class learned to position themselves as mediators between humanity and the divine. Not because humans needed a mediator, but because mediators could collect the flow of devotion and direct it. In temples, monasteries, and cathedrals, priests were trained in how to evoke guilt, reverence, awe, and spiritual longing, all emotional states that open the heart. Open heart means open essence. When studying church vampire protocols, researchers found recurring patterns: confession drains, chanting sustains, prayer directs. These are not merely spiritual acts, they are energetic transactions. Think of the moment in confession when a believer reveals their private shame. Their guard drops, their vulnerability becomes total. In ordinary human relationships, vulnerability creates bonding. But in hierarchical spiritual structures, vulnerability creates extraction. The believer leaves feeling lighter because they gave something away. The priest leaves feeling grounded, calm, powerful, because they received. None of this requires deception. The system functions as long as people believe surrender is virtue. Occult church secrets are less about hidden texts and more about psychological architecture. Collective prayer intensifies this effect. When hundreds of people fix their attention on a single figure or symbol, the emotional atmosphere thickens. You can feel it. Goosebumps, warmth, tears, trembling. This isn't mystical. It's human physiology responding to synchronized focus. But in esoteric vampire theology, The priest is trained to stand at the center of this emotional storm, absorbing the energetic resonance like a conductor absorbing charge. The congregation believes they are receiving grace. In reality, they are generating it. The one who directs the ritual receives the overflow. And this isn't limited to churches. Think about celebrities, political leaders, motivational speakers. Whenever a crowd gathers to admire one central figure, energy moves toward that figure. You have felt this. You have seen someone walk off stage glowing while the audience leaves emotionally exhausted. This is vampire protocol explained in modern language. Energy flows to where attention is directed. The church simply mastered this before anyone else and wrapped it in sacredness so no one would question it. The key psychological mechanism here is dependency. If a believer thinks they need the priest to access forgiveness, salvation, or divine love, they will return again and again. The ritual becomes a loop: surrender, relief, dependency, surrender again. This loop is what sustains vampire priest ritual hierarchies. The priest is not a villain. The priest is simply the beneficiary of a structure designed to funnel vitality upward. The more believers, the more energy. The larger the cathedral, the greater the harvest. Scale equals power, but something happens when enough people recognize this pattern, when they realize their emotional, mental, and spiritual energy is powerful, valuable, even radiant, when they see that the feeling of being drained after worship is not a mystery but a transaction, and when they understand that devotion is not inherently sacred, it is directional. Devotion given consciously nourishes oneself. Devotion given unconsciously nourishes another, which leads us to the most provocative revelation yet. The vampire was never outside the church. The vampire was the priest in plain sight. And that is exactly what the next topic reveals fully. The image of the vampire we know today, pale, nocturnal, robed in darkness, did not originate in folklore about the undead. It came from the priesthood. Pale skin was not a sign of bloodlessness. It was the mark of those who spent their lives inside stone sanctuaries, away from sunlight. Their silence, their solitude, their intense study of spiritual geometry, these traits shaped the archetype that literature would later twist into horror. But originally, the vampire archetype priesthood referred to clergy who had mastered the art of absorbing devotion, reverence, and emotional surrender. The church did not invent the vampire myth to warn the faithful about demons. It invented the myth to hide the priest. In ancient texts, the vampire is described not as a predator of bodies, but of life force. He does not chase victims, he invites them. He does not frighten them, he comforts them. This is the essence of spiritual energy vampire church dynamics. The victim comes willingly, believing the exchange is sacred. The vampire's true power is not strength, but authority. He stands elevated, robed in meaning, speaking in a voice softened by ritual cadence. His presence is warm, reassuring, holy, and this is what makes him untouchable, because no one suspects the one who feeds to be the one who blesses. Look again at the traditional vampire symbols, the chalice and the cloak, the ritual chamber lit by candles. These are not the tools of monsters, they are the tools of clergy. The chalice is used in occult blood covenant protocols, the cloak in sacred vestments, the candlelight in liturgical ambience meant to induce emotional openness. The vampire moves at night because night is when the unconscious is most accessible. Monasteries held vigils not during the day, but after sunset. The time when minds are softer, when longing turns into surrender, when the heart is easier to open. Even the myth of immortality ties back to the priestly class. Priests were seen as conduits of the eternal, not because they were eternal, but because they absorbed vitality from those around them. A priest surrounded by constant devotion does not wither like ordinary men. This is why elders of the church often aged slowly, serenely, gracefully. Their vitality was replenished through ritual cycles. Church vampire history revealed that this wasn't supernatural. It was energetic economics, a system of intake and output, where intake always exceeded output. The vampire's aversion to mirrors is symbolic, not literal. Mirrors represent self-awareness. Priests were taught never to question the structure that sustained them. If they truly saw the exchange, if they saw that the light in their eyes was borrowed, they might collapse under the weight of recognition. Rituals were designed to reinforce identity. You are the chosen, the ordained, the vessel of God. This self-concept protected the priest from guilt, which is essential because guilt closes the heart and blocks the flow. This is why vampire priest secrets exposed always come back to emotional manipulation, not violence. The vampire's need for invitation is also telling. In mythology, a vampire cannot enter a home unless invited. In reality, the priest requires consent. The believer must willingly surrender attention, devotion, and emotional vulnerability. Without permission, the exchange cannot happen. This is the most elegant mechanism in vampire protocol explained. The victim participates in their own depletion. The system sustains itself because people think they are choosing it. Choice, when uninformed, is the most powerful form of captivity, and so the vampire was never meant to be feared. He was meant to be revered, not rejected, but followed, not hidden, but enthroned. The vampire myth did not disguise a monster, it disguised a hierarchy. And once this becomes visible, a more unsettling question emerges. If the priest is the vampire, then what is the ritual that seals this exchange? The answer has a name, and it has been whispered for centuries. The Red Mass. There is a ritual spoken of only in fragments, hidden in footnotes of medieval manuscripts, referenced in letters between bishops, and whispered in the confessional halls of old cathedrals. It is known as the Red Mass. Most imagine something demonic, theatrical, filled with violence or grotesque sacrifice. But the true Red Mass is nothing like that. It is quiet, controlled, beautiful, even. It takes place when the chalice is turned upside down, and the prayer is spoken not forward in but backward, reversing the direction of spiritual flow. In ordinary Mass, devotion rises from the congregation toward the divine. In the Red Mass, the flow reverses. Life force moves from the congregation to the celebrant. Scholars of church vampire protocols describe it as a ritual of harvesting, not offering. This ritual did not originate in Christianity. Its roots stretch back to the temples of Canaan and Ugarit, where priest-kings performed rites meant to bind the strength of the people to the ruler. The church did not destroy this practice. It simply sealed it beneath new language. In cathedral crypts, where only the initiated were allowed, the Red Mass became the ceremonial core of secret vampire rituals, preserved without interruption. Bread and wine were not consumed, but held. The congregation was led into a state of reverent longing, and then suspended there, emotion wide open, essence unguarded. And in that stillness, the celebrant absorbed the bloom of devotion like incense rising into lungs. The key to the ritual is reversal. Just as breath can be drawn in or released, devotion can be directed or absorbed. The priest whispers the liturgy backward, not as sorcery, but as a psychological mechanism. Backward speech fractures the conscious mind, placing the listener into a dreamlike trance. In this state, the heart opens further, unprotected. This is how the vampire priest ritual becomes effortless. No coercion, no violence, no shock, only a gentle redirection of the worshipper's own longing. The priest becomes a still point at the center of an emotional storm that he does not create, but collects. Participants rarely realize what has happened. They walk away believing they have experienced something profound, something holy, something intimate with the divine. And in a sense they have. The experience is real, the energy is real, the warmth in their chest, the tears in their eyes, the trembling in their hands. Real. But what they do not realize is that the strength they felt in the room did not stay with them. It gathered around the celebrant. The congregation leaves exhausted, lightheaded, emotionally raw. The priest leaves serene, empowered, glowing. This differential is the mark of spiritual energy vampire church dynamics. The exchange is not symbolic, it is physiological. The Red Mass was often performed during Lentachau burials or political transitions, moments when collective emotion was highest. This amplified the yield. Entire cities could be spiritually drained in a single ceremony, and the church learned that power gathered through grief, longing, and awe was far more potent than power gathered through joy. This is why so many sermons center on guilt and suffering. Dark occult church practices are based on the principle that a broken heart releases more energy than a fulfilled one. The ritual does not need to break the body, only the spirit. Even today, remnants of the Red Mass continue, especially in ceremonies involving judges, politicians, and military figures. The public sees symbolism. The initiated understand alignment. Power seeks power, and power must be fed. The celebrant in these ceremonies is not blessing leaders, he is binding them, drawing their life force into the institution and feeding institution back into them. A covenant, a tether, a chain wrapped in silk. Occult blood covenant protocols do not need to be named to be active. And perhaps the most haunting truth is this: the Red Mass is only effective when the participants do not know it is happening. The ritual depends entirely on unconscious consent, which leads to the most dangerous revelation of all. What happens when people become conscious of their own energy? What happens when they stop feeding the hierarchy? What happens when they reclaim what they have given? That is where the fear begins. There is a reason knowledge was once guarded behind locked libraries, monastic orders, and forbidden manuscripts. The Church did not fear heresy because heresy was wrong. It feared heresy because heresy breaks the spell. Once a person understands that their attention, devotion, emotion, and longing are sources of energy, they stop giving them away unconsciously. And when that happens, the hierarchy collapses. A priest stands only as tall as the believer kneels. If the believer stands, the structure falls. Scholars examining church vampire protocols often phrase it this way: the Church does not fear evil. The Church fears sovereignty. Imagine telling someone that every time they pray in desperation, every time they confess in guilt, every time they worship in longing, they are generating power, and that power is not disappearing, it is going somewhere. The moment a person understands this, they begin to ask, if my energy has value, why have I been giving it away? This is the question the Church has avoided for centuries. The moment a believer realizes they are the source, not the supplicant, they no longer look up, they look inward, and inward-looking people are ungovernable. This threatens hidden cult in the church structures more than any demon or doctrine ever could. This is why the Church historically punished heresy with execution, not debate. You do not kill a belief because it is wrong, you kill a belief because it is dangerously true. The uninitiated learning how life force is exchanged would dissolve spiritual energy vampire church dynamics overnight. Every ritual built on unconscious surrender relies on the believer not knowing what they are giving. Knowledge awakens self-preservation. After all, someone who knows they are being drained will no longer kneel willingly. They will close the door. They will seal the aura. They will break the chain. Even in modern times, you can see how information that encourages inner sovereignty is treated. It is mocked, suppressed, dismissed as New Age, pseudoscientific, or dangerous to faith. But the danger is not to the faith. It is to the funnel, to the directional flow, to the hierarchy that only works when devotion moves upward. The clergy understands this instinctively, even if they never articulate it. Their authority is sustained by the belief that grace flows down while devotion flows up. But in Vampire Protocol explained, this direction reverses once the believer wakes up. Consider the emotional reaction a person has when they suddenly understand they have been giving away their power for years. There is grief, there is anger, there is liberation, there is relief. And then there is a silence, a deep, powerful silence. This silence is the soul closing the channel. It is the moment when the flame no longer flickers, but stands upright, unyielding. This is the moment that terrifies institutions. One sovereign individual can disrupt centuries of conditioning simply by refusing to surrender. The Church does not know how to control someone who does not kneel. This is why secret vampire rituals depend on ritual programming. People must be taught from childhood to kneel, to obey, to confess, to surrender. They must believe their value lies in being forgiven, not in being free. But once a person sees that forgiveness was a mechanism for extraction and that the intermediary was unnecessary all along, the illusion dissolves. The believer realizes the divine was never above them. The divine was within them, and the priest becomes what he always was, a man who needs energy to sustain the identity he was given. And so we arrive at the threshold of the Church's greatest fear. If the people stop feeding the structure dies, the ritual ends, the hierarchy crumbles. The vampire is revealed not as a monster, but as a dependent. And once the illusion breaks, there is no going back. But if the priest is not the ultimate recipient of this energy, then who is? The answer doesn't point to heaven. It points somewhere in between. If the priest is not the final recipient of the life force being offered, then the hierarchy must extend beyond human hands. And indeed, ancient mystics, desert fathers, and early Gnostic theologians taught that priests were not serving God directly. They were serving intermediaries, beings neither angelic nor demonic, but something older, something that exists entirely on the plane of emotion, devotion, awe, and fear. These beings do not feast on flesh. They feast on attention, on longing, on surrender. This is why spiritual energy vampire church structures function the way they do. The priest is the conduit, not the consumer. These entities were described in early manuscripts as hungry winds, whispering presences, the watchers behind the throne. They were said to form an invisible hierarchy mirroring the church's physical one. The clergy stood in robes and gold. The entities stood in silence and shadow. The rituals, chants, confessions, and masses were not designed to convert the soul to salvation. They were designed to generate emotional resonance, which these beings consumed. This is why worship must be repeated, why guilt must be sustained, why longing must never be fulfilled. This is the foundation of church vampire protocols hidden beneath doctrine. To understand what these beings are, one must stop thinking in terms of monsters. They are not beasts with claws and fangs. They are ecosystems, systems that survive through attention the way fire survives through oxygen. When a congregation sings a hymn together with trembling voices and open hearts, a field of emotional energy blooms. That field doesn't just disappear. It flows, it accumulates. And throughout history, priests trained to direct that flow upward, not to heaven as the faithful believed, but to the hidden cult in the church that served the watchers behind the veil. This is why worship often centers on suffering, guilt, sacrifice, and inadequacy. These emotional states produce the strongest energetic release. Joy generates energy too, but joy circulates. Guilt, longing, and awe leak. They spill, they pour. And dark occult church practices refine the emotional engineering of ritual to maximize leakage. This is why incense, organ tones, candlelight, and stained glass are used. They weaken the conscious mind and heighten the emotional body. And when the emotional body is open, the flow begins. These entities do not care whether the worshipper is right, good, holy, or devout. They do not require belief. They require resonance, and resonance is created by focus. This is why prayer looks remarkably similar to meditation, but produces the opposite effect. Meditation draws energy back inward. Prayer sends it outward. Meditation seals the soul. Prayer exposes it. Meditation nourishes. Prayer surrenders. In Vampire Protocol explained as meditation is the lock, prayer is the open door. Yet it is crucial to understand, these beings are not evil in the moral sense. They are simply hungry. As humans feed on plants and animals, as forests feed on sunlight and decay, these entities feed on devotion. They are part of the metaphysical ecosystem of consciousness, but problems arise when humans forget the exchange is happening, when worship becomes addiction, when surrender becomes identity, when the worshipper believes they are empty without the one who receives. This belief is the crown jewel of esoteric vampire theology. The idea that your soul is insufficient on its own. Once someone understands this dynamic, they begin to feel something subtle, the sense that they have been feeding something unseen for a very long time. Every tear shed in prayer, every moment of shame, every whispered confession, every plea for mercy, the energy did not vanish, it moved. And the soul begins to ask the one question the church fears most. If something has been feeding from me, then how do I stop feeding it? The answer to that question is the final revelation, and it changes everything. There is a moment, quiet, subtle, unmistakable, when a person realizes that every prayer, every confession, every tear shed in desperation, every plea whispered into the dark was not simply emotional expression, it was offering, a giving, a transfer. And once this realization appears, it cannot be unseen. If attention is nourishment, if emotion is currency, if surrender is energy, then you have been feeding something your entire life. Not because you were foolish, but because no one told you what your energy was worth. The greatest secret of church vampire protocols is not how the energy is taken. It's how the believer is convinced they have nothing to lose. Think back on every moment you knelt in fear, guilt, or longing. Those moments produced the richest essence, the most radiant life force. This is why religious institutions, political movements, cults, and charismatic leaders all revolve around creating emotional intensity. Emotion opens the soul, and an open soul pours. Whether the priest intended it consciously or merely inherited the system, the result was the same. Your vitality flowed upward. Spiritual energy vampire church dynamics work because the believer thinks they are empty, flawed, sinful, needing forgiveness. But what if the truth is that you were overflowing all along? The final shift happens when a person stops praying outward and begins listening inward. When they realize the warmth they felt during worship was not something entering them, but something leaving. The peace they felt afterward was not grace, it was release. The exhaustion was not spiritual warfare, it was depletion. And the presence of God they felt was not an external being. It was the echo of their own life force filling the room. This understanding dismantles vampire priest ritual authority in an instant. Because once the source recognizes itself as the source, the hierarchy has nothing left to stand on. And this is where sovereignty begins. Not rebellion, not rejection, not atheism. Sovereignty. The quiet awareness that your essence belongs to you, that your emotional energy is sacred, that your attention is a throne, and whoever sits upon it rules your world. This is what the church has always feared, that the believer would learn to sit upon their own throne. This is why doctrine emphasizes obedience, surrender, humility, unworthiness, because a sovereign soul cannot be harvested. A sovereign soul is closed to extraction. And this threatens not only hidden cult in the church structures, but the entities they serve. Once a person understands they have been feeding something, the next question arises naturally: how do I stop? The answer is shockingly simple. Stop kneeling. Stop surrendering your emotional energy outward. Stop praying to be saved. Stop asking for permission to exist. Close the loop. Breathe your energy inward. Let devotion be a flame that warms you, not a torch held out to be taken. Meditation becomes reclamation, stillness becomes nourishment, presence becomes shield. This is the essence of reversing vampire protocol explained, and no institution can prevent it once it begins. The church has always said, "The kingdom of God is within you," yet it taught believers to seek everywhere except within. The greatest paradox of esoteric vampire theology is that it hid truth inside Scripture, while training people to ignore the meaning. The divine spark, the breath of life, the Holy Spirit, these are metaphors for your own vitality, the essence you have been offering, the treasure you never knew you held. Waking up is not about rejecting the sacred. It is about reclaiming it from those who take without giving. And now the final realization dawns. Not dramatic, not frightening, but silent and undeniable. The ritual only continues if you continue participating. The church does not drain you. The priest does not drain you. The entities do not drain you. You are the one opening the door. And now you can close it. Now that you've seen the patterns, the symbols, and the mechanics behind church vampire protocols, the question is no longer whether these practices exist. The question is what you choose to do with this awareness. Your energy has always been powerful. Your attention has always been nourishment. And your devotion has always been a living force. The difference now is that you can direct it consciously, instead of surrendering it automatically to spiritual energy, vampire church hierarchies that were never meant to own your soul. So ask yourself, gently but honestly, who have I been feeding? Have you been giving your emotional energy to guilt, fear, authority, or longing? Or have you been giving it to your own growth, clarity, grounding, and sovereignty? If you want to reclaim yourself, start with small acts of awareness. When you feel the urge to kneel, pause. When you feel the need to confess, reflect inward instead. When you feel yourself reaching upward, breathe downward, into your own body. This alone begins to break the vampire priest ritual cycle. Not through rebellion, but through remembrance. You are not empty. You were never lacking. You were convinced that your inner flame belonged to someone else. But now you know how to keep your energy within you, not leaking outward into occult church secret structures that feed more than they give. Your life force is yours, and it can fuel your awakening, your clarity, your purpose, your healing. So before you leave, answer this in the comments. What part of yourself are you taking back today? Your voice matters here. Your awakening strengthens others. Your presence feeds no one but you, unless you choose otherwise. And if you want to continue exploring hidden histories, esoteric sovereignty, and the truth behind church vampire history revealed, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. There are many more layers to uncover, and you won't want to miss what comes next.